My name is Meryl, and I'm 22 years old. I just graduated from college, and I feel like it's time to tell you the story of the house that changed my life. Technically, it was my mother's house. Or, to be more precise, it belonged to her until she passed away from colon cancer 4 years ago and left it to me. My mom was always someone who planned everything meticulously. Even in the hardest times, when she was given that terrible diagnosis, she never backed down. She made sure everything was in order, the house remained fully hers, free of debts or obligations. She had bought it before she even met my father, and honestly, I thank God for that. Mom often told me how important it was to always have a place to return to. The will is in place. Everything will be fine, Meryl, she would say to me in her calm voice, which never betrayed her inner struggles. She always tried to stay strong, even when the cancer began to drain her strength. When I was a child, things didn't always seem so complicated. My parents had been married for 10 years before my father decided to leave us. I was 9 when he packed his things and just walked away. No loud fights, no arguments about custody, no disputes over property. The only thing he did was open a savings account for my future education. As he put it, that was his version of child support. Dad quickly moved on with his life. He married a woman named Linda, who was 10 years younger than him, and soon they had a daughter together. I occasionally visited them and stayed at their house. But it never felt quite right. Linda was always busy with her daughter, my half-sister. She would constantly talk about her achievements, do her hair, or plan her schedule. And my dad? He was always at work. I got the sense that his family was them, while I was somewhere on the outskirts of his life. Meryl, will you stay for dinner? Linda would ask, but her tone always revealed her hope that I'd decline. Our relationship was polite but distant. We exchanged holiday cards, sometimes sat at the same table, keeping the conversation light. It was all too proper, too stiff, as if an invisible barrier stood between us that none of us wanted to break. My mom was different. She earned enough as a senior accountant to provide us with a comfortable life. When she was diagnosed, I was 14. She quit her job, deciding to dedicate herself fully to her treatment. We spent 4 years between hospital visits, chemotherapy sessions, and her endless attempts to make sure I'd be okay. She fought hard, but cancer proved stronger. When Mom passed away, I was 18. It happened just weeks before I was supposed to leave for college. Grief overwhelmed me like a massive wave, and I could barely manage day-to-day tasks. And then something happened that I least expected. My father offered his help. Linda and my half-sister temporarily moved in with me to help me cope with the loss. "We'll help you get through this, Meryl," Dad said, placing his hand on my shoulder. Linda nodded, trying to look sympathetic, while my half-sister wandered around the house, exploring what now belonged to me. By the end of that summer, I faced a dilemma. College was starting in a few weeks, and I had to decide what to do with the house. Sell it? I couldn't even fathom the idea. Leave it empty for 4 years? That seemed just as illogical. The house was too important to me, too deeply tied to my mom's memory. But what could I do? That's when Dad made his proposal over breakfast. "Meryl," he said, pushing aside his coffee mug, "I've been thinking. What if we stayed? We'll pay all the bills, maintain the house, and you won't have to worry about a thing while you're in college." I looked at Linda, who was standing by the stove flipping pancakes. Turning to me, she smiled, as if this had been a carefully crafted plan she'd been mulling over for weeks. "It would be good for all of us," she added, nodding slightly but confidently. "Sophie is already enrolled in the local school, and will take care of the house." I nodded hesitantly. It actually made sense. During the 2 months they'd been living with me, everything had unexpectedly fallen into place. Linda stopped seeming so distant, and Sophie, my half-sister, began to see me not as an occasional visitor but as part of her family. She was into art and showed me her new drawings every day, which I eagerly praised. Honestly, the decision felt almost perfect. I packed up my mom's personal belongings, keeping the items that reminded me of her the most: her favorite coffee mug with a faded sunflower design, an old wool blanket, and a cookbook with her handwritten notes in the margins. The rest I carefully boxed up and stored in the attic. That space always felt sacred to me, as if my mom's things were protected from the passage of time there. And so, with everything ready, I left for college, leaving the house in the care of Dad, Linda, and Sophie. For the next 4 years, I returned there for holidays and vacations. Those visits filled me with warmth and something new that I couldn't quite put my finger on. At Christmas, we decorated the tree together, always arguing with Linda about whether tinsel on the branches was charming or tacky. Sophie laughed as Dad lifted her up to place the star on top. Afterwards, we'd drink hot chocolate, sit in the living room, and chat about little things that, for some reason, started to mean so much to me. Summers were more laid back. I took Sophie to the pool, we read books for her school assignments, and in the evenings, Linda invited me to her book club meetings. They usually discussed light romance novels, and I found myself laughing along with them, enjoying the unexpected simplicity of it all. One evening, I overheard Linda talking to Dad. "You know, I like how Meryl gets along with Sophie. It makes our house feel real." For some reason, her words warmed me, like a cozy blanket on a winter evening. I began to believe that we had truly become a family, albeit an odd one, pieced together from fragments of different lives. I called them regularly during the semesters, discussing my exams with Dad, listening to Linda's updates about the gardens she was now tending to, and FaceTiming with Sophie, who showed me her drawings and talked about her school life. We had built this strange but cozy world. It was rooted in memories of Mom, in her house, which had become the thread that connected us all. However, as I would later realize, homes always hide more behind their walls than what's visible on the surface. No matter how strong the foundation, it can't prevent cracks that slowly spread unnoticed. But at the time, I wasn't thinking about any of that. I had graduated college, earned my degree, and was preparing for a new chapter in my life. I quickly found a job. I accepted an offer from Marshall and Brooks Financial, the company that had interviewed me over Zoom. The job was in my hometown, and I gladly took it as a sign that everything was falling into place. It felt like I was coming home. But what did home mean? The words suddenly seemed layered, as if it held more than just the place where I had grown up. I was returning to where it all began, ready to uncover what lay behind those walls. Everything seemed perfect. Or at least, I thought it was. The taxi dropped me off right in front of my house on a sunny June afternoon. I paused for a moment to admire the familiar sight. Mom's rose bushes were in full bloom, their vibrant petals seeming to welcome me after my long absence. Yet, something about them was different, slightly less tended to than when Mom had lovingly cared for them herself. The lawn was neatly trimmed, and new curtains hung in the windows, small but noticeable changes that had happened while I was away. None of it felt unsettling, though. It all seemed natural. Dragging my suitcases up the front path, I felt my heart fill with a pleasant excitement. Here it was, my home. The house where I had grown up, the house that had been a refuge during the hardest times. I reached for my keys, already picturing how I'd sleep in my old room tonight, surrounded by familiar smells and things. But when I inserted the key into the lock, something was wrong. The key wouldn't turn. At first, I thought I was just tired from the trip and that was making me clumsy. I tried again, nothing. My heart began to race slightly. What the hell? I muttered, feeling irritation mixed with growing unease. After a few more attempts, I gave up and knocked on the door loudly. It was midday. They had to be home. Maybe they were watching TV or cooking lunch. The door opened a minute later. Linda stood there in an apron, her hands dusted with flour. Her face registered surprise as soon as she saw me. "Meryl," she said, trying to smile, but her voice sounded cautious. "What are you doing here?" I rolled my suitcase inside, noticing how the space had changed. In the living room, Dad and Sophie were absorbed in their own activities but immediately looked up at me. Dad was reading on a tablet, comfortably settled in the armchair that had once belonged to Mom, while Sophie sprawled on the couch, scrolling through something on her phone. Their faces showed simultaneous surprise, and it was strange. "What am I doing here?" I repeated, frowning. "I live here." I glanced around the living room, noticing new decorations, a couple of throw pillows on the couch, updated family photos on the mantel. Small changes, but somehow unsettling. "Why is there a different lock on the door?" I asked, turning to Dad. He avoided my gaze, nervously scratching his neck, a habit I remembered from childhood. He always did that when he was uncomfortable. "Oh, yeah. We changed it last month," he mumbled. "For safety, you know. There were a few break-ins in the neighborhood. You could have told me. Or sent me a new key," I said, trying to mask my growing irritation. "It's my house, after all." Linda's face showed a faint tension. She crossed her arms and took a step back. "We didn't expect you so soon," she replied, her voice quiet but clear. "Why?" I looked at all three of them. "I finished school last week. I told you I was coming back home to start my new job." My words hung in the air. Dad got up from his chair, his face taking on a strained expression. "Meryl," he said, gesturing toward the study, "can we talk?" I followed him into the room that had once been Mom's office. Technically, it was now my office, but her diplomas still hung on the walls, and her reference books were neatly arranged on the shelves. I looked around, and a strange feeling washed over me, as if something was missing from the room, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what. Dad closed the door behind us, and I noticed his hands trembling slightly. He turned to me, his gaze lowered. "Listen, sweetheart," he began, his voice soft, almost apologetic. "There's something you need to know." "What is it?" I asked, a growing sense of unease creeping into my chest. He sighed, avoiding my eyes. "Linda, she thinks this house belongs to me." I stared at him, trying to process what he had just said. "What?" I asked, my voice shaking. "She believes that I let your mother and you live here after the divorce out of kindness," he continued. "And after your mom passed away, the house reverted to me." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You lied to her?" I asked, locking eyes with him. "This house was Mom's. She left it to me. You know that." Dad didn't respond. His shoulders slumped, and his gaze stayed fixed on the floor. I stood there, a wave of anger and disappointment crashing over me. My first instinct was to storm out of the office and tell Linda everything. Now her surprised look when I showed up made sense. In her mind, I was nothing more than a freeloader trying to come back to a place where I didn't belong. That thought enraged me. She deserved to know the truth. I started toward the door, but Dad grabbed my arm. His face was pale, his expression almost pleading. "Please, Meryl," he whispered, just louder than a breath. "Just give me a little time. I'll find us a new place to live. I promise. I just need to figure out how to tell Linda in a way that won't ruin our marriage." I felt the anger inside me ignite, burning like fire rising from my chest to my head. "Ruin your marriage?" I hissed. "What about what you're doing to me?" "This is my house, Dad." He slowly pulled a set of keys from his pocket and held them out to me, as if offering an olive branch. "These are for the new locks," he said, his voice filled with regret. Please, sweetheart, just a few weeks. That's all I'm asking. Let me handle this my way. I took the keys, feeling nauseous swirl in my stomach. My heart ached with betrayal, but I decided to step back. Fine, I finally exhaled. But this is insane, Dad. You know that, right? He nodded, relief washing over his face. Thank you, sweetheart. I'll fix this. I promise. But things unraveled almost immediately. Dinner that evening was a disaster. The atmosphere at the table was taut, like a string stretched too tightly. Linda kept throwing subtle, appraising glances my way, her expression full of thinly veiled irritation. All the warmth and friendliness she'd once shown me had vanished, like smoke dissipating into the air. The woman who had once baked my favorite cookies and invited me to her book club now acted as though I were a stranger invading her space. More potatoes? Sophie asked, completely oblivious to the tension in the room. She was still the carefree girl I remembered. Would anyone mind if I redecorated the living room? Linda suddenly asked, her tone casual but with a clear undertone. She didn't even look at me as she spoke. The current setup feels a bit outdated. My fingers tightened around my fork, the metal digging into my palm. I knew exactly what she meant, Mom's furniture arrangement. This was her way of staking a claim, of declaring that the house now belonged to her. Dad coughed awkwardly and quickly tried to change the subject, but the tension had already settled in the room like a heavy fog. The next morning, I was making coffee in the kitchen, trying to prepare myself for the day, when Linda appeared unexpectedly. She was in a robe, her hair disheveled, but her gaze was sharp and focused. "Meryl," she said, leaning against the counter. "We need to talk about your plans." I set my cup down on the table and looked at her. "My plans?" "Yes," she continued with deliberate nonchalance. "When do you plan to find your own place? Now that you have a job, it's time you started thinking about moving out. You're an adult now, after all." I took a slow sip of coffee, trying to hold back the storm of emotions brewing inside me. In my mind, I silently counted to 10 to keep from snapping. "Actually, I already spoke to Dad about staying here for a while," I replied, keeping my voice as calm as I could. "He's fine with it." Linda's lips pressed into a thin line. For a moment, I thought she was going to argue, but instead, she turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving me alone with my cooling coffee and a growing sense of unease. The next 2 weeks were a true test of patience. Linda's attitude shifted from cold indifference to outright passive aggressiveness. She started accidentally washing my clothes with items that bled color, claiming she had mixed up the laundry baskets. Her dinners, which used to be for the whole family, were now prepared for exactly 3 people. "Oh, sorry, I didn't realize you'd be eating with us," she'd say with feigned regret whenever I sat down at the table. If I tried to watch TV in the living room, Linda would immediately start vacuuming right there. When I made myself breakfast, she'd suddenly begin reorganizing the cabinets, muttering something about how some people never learn to keep things tidy. But the biggest blow came when she moved my mom's favorite vase from its spot on the mantel. It now sat on a corner shelf, lost among cheap trinkets. "It doesn't fit the new decor," Linda explained, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. I tried to remain calm, but with each passing day, my patience wore thinner. This house, which had always been a symbol of safety for me, now felt like a battleground where I had to fight for my place. The hardest part was how Sophie had changed. My stepsister, who just weeks ago had sent me funny memes and called me for advice about boys, now felt like a stranger. She rolled her eyes whenever I entered a room, as if my mere presence disrupted her peace. Worse, she started referring to me as "that girl" when talking to her friends on the phone, loud enough for me to hear. Those little barbs cut deeper than I expected because, at one point, I had genuinely hoped we'd grow closer. If my home life was crumbling, my professional life, on the other hand, was finally gaining momentum. Last week, I visited the Marshall and Brooks financial office for the first time, where they showed me my future workspace, a spacious corner desk with a view of downtown. Sunlight streamed in through the large windows, filling the room with warmth, and I felt my heart swell with anticipation. The colleagues I met were friendly, especially Sarah from the risk assessment team, a vibrant woman with an infectious laugh. She even invited me to lunch. "When you start, be sure to join us. There's a fantastic cafe around the corner." "I know you'll love it," she said, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was becoming part of something exciting and new. 2 weeks from now, I replied with a smile. It seemed like just enough time to prepare and settle in, at home. That evening at dinner, I tried to share this bit of good news with my family. It felt like an opportunity to restore some semblance of normalcy. "They showed me my office today," I said as I cut into the piece of meat on my plate. "I start in 2 weeks." The sound of Linda carefully setting her fork down on her plate cut through the awkward silence. She looked at me, her expression unreadable. "That's wonderful, Meryl," she said, forcing a tight smile. "And once you get your first paycheck, you can start looking for an apartment. I know a few nice complexes in town that would be perfect for a young professional like you." Her words hung in the air. I caught my dad's pleading look, his eyes practically begging me, "Don't start a fight." He was trying to maintain the illusion of peace, but in that moment, all I felt was the sting of betrayal. I didn't respond. I simply pushed the peas around on my plate, letting the tension in the room become unbearable. To distract myself, I started reconnecting with old friends from high school. Katie and Jessica still lived in town, and our coffee dates and shopping trips felt like a return to simpler times. We laughed, reminisced, and it felt as though the years apart had never happened. But each time I returned home, the same cold atmosphere awaited me. The moment I walked through the door, conversations in the kitchen or living room would stop. Linda and Dad looked as if they'd been caught doing something they weren't supposed to, hurriedly shuffling papers or turning away with forced smiles. Those moments made me feel like an outsider in my own home. One Saturday morning, I woke up to an unusual silence. The house was so quiet, it felt empty. No sounds of Linda in the kitchen, no music from Sophie's room, no TV tuned to the sports channel where Dad usually sat. I went downstairs, still in my pajamas, with a vague sense of unease. The kitchen was spotless. Not just clean, spotless, as though no one had touched it since the night before. Everything looked too perfect. The decorative pillows on the couch were arranged with precise symmetry. Sophie's shoes, which normally cluttered the entryway, were gone. Even Dad's car was missing from the driveway. I checked my phone. No messages, no calls, no notes left on the table. Nothing. For a moment, I thought maybe they had just gone out for breakfast, but something about the pristine cleanliness of the house threw me off balance. The emptiness didn't feel natural. Trying to calm myself, I made some coffee and decided to wait. An hour passed, then another. My unease grew stronger with each minute. My mind began conjuring up all sorts of scenarios, each one more bizarre than the last. Where could they have gone without leaving a single hint? They never went out for breakfast without at least leaving a note. Even during these tense weeks, when the house had been locked in something resembling hostile détente, small courtesies like this were always observed. Their sudden disappearance without any warning felt especially strange. The first thing I did was call my dad. His phone went straight to voicemail. Weird, I thought and tried again. The same result, the automated voice informing me that the number was unavailable. The knot in my stomach tightened. Struggling to keep my worry in check, I decided to call Linda. On the fourth ring, just as I was about to hang up, she finally answered. "What do you want?" she snapped, her voice laced with a hostility I had never heard before. In the background, I caught the sound of waves and the faint melody of tropical music. I just wanted to know where everyone is, I said, caught off guard by her tone. I woke up, and the house was empty. Linda laughed. It was a cruel, venomous laugh that made my stomach churn even more. Oh, didn't we tell you? We're in the Maldives, she said with exaggerated ease. First class, luxury resort. We decided we needed a little getaway. You left? I barely managed to get the words out. Yes, and honestly, we didn't mention it because we didn't want you tagging along and expecting us to pay for you. Not that you know much about paying for things yourself, do you? Her voice dripped with condescension. Linda, I began, but she cut me off. Listen, I'm done with this situation, she snapped. You're just a lazy freeloader living in our house as if it belongs to you. Maybe your father has tolerated it, but I won't. I'm sick to death of seeing you here. Do you know how embarrassing it is? A grown woman eating our food, using our utilities. My hands were trembling so much I could barely hold the phone. I sank into one of the kitchen chairs, my legs suddenly too weak to support me. It was my mom's chair. Linda, I tried again, but she didn't let me speak. No, you listen to me, she hissed. Your father never even loved you. You were just an obligation to him. He's already spent enough money on you, putting you through college. And now you're living in our house like some entitled princess. Well, I've had enough. Did you really think you could just stay here forever? Pretending you have a right to mooch off us while we work hard to keep this house running? In the background, I heard Sophie giggling and my dad's muffled voice. He was saying something, but I couldn't make out the words. Every accusation she hurled at me felt like the lash of a whip. When we get back, Linda continued, her voice cold and sharp as a blade, I don't want to see you here. Pack your things and get out of our house. If you're still here when we return, I'll throw you out myself. And trust me, I won't be gentle. I don't care where you go, live on the street for all I care. You're not our problem anymore. My heart clenched. And don't bother trying to call your father, she added with a sneer. He agrees with me. He's just too much of a coward to tell you himself. Oh, and by the way, we've already blocked your number. Have a nice life, Meryl. Or don't. I couldn't care less. The line went dead. I sat there in the kitchen, staring into nothingness. The betrayal felt like a physical blow. This house was my mom's, her pride, her sanctuary. She had worked her entire life to leave it to me. And now they had the audacity to call me a freeloader and order me out of my own home. Rage slowly replaced the shock. My mom had fought for this house, and I wasn't going to let them take it away so easily. I was done playing along with my dad's lies. I blocked their numbers on my phone. My hands were still trembling, but now it wasn't from fear, it was from anger. The fire in my chest gave me the energy I needed to act. Methodically, I started going through the house, gathering their belongings. Linda's expensive clothes, Sophie's school supplies, Dad's golf clubs, all of it went into boxes and suitcases. Every item they had brought into this house felt foreign to me, like it disrupted the natural order of things. I worked tirelessly all day Saturday, driven by bitter disappointment and a fierce determination to reclaim my space. By Sunday morning, their lives were packed up and neatly stored in the garage like unwanted baggage. When I finally exhaled, a strange sense of relief washed over me. I found a 24-hour locksmith who was able to come immediately. He replaced the locks on every door, including the back door and the one leading from the house to the garage. It cost a small fortune, but every penny was worth the peace of mind I felt as I held the new keys in my hand. This was my house, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I truly owned it. On Monday morning, I started my new job at Marshall & Brooks Financial. Throwing myself into learning my new responsibilities, I used work as a distraction from the tense situation at home. My colleagues were friendly, and my first few days felt as though I had been part of the team for years. Sarah from the risk assessment department invited me to lunch, and I struck up conversations with other coworkers, gradually building a new network. Work became a refuge, a place where I could finally breathe freely. But every evening, coming home reminded me of what was coming. I knew they wouldn't let this go so easily. While I stored their belongings in the garage, I busied myself with rearranging the house. Every trace of Linda's presence was erased, her decorative pillows, her trinkets, even that awful vanilla-scented room freshener she loved. I restored everything to how my mom had arranged it. The paintings she had chosen went back on the walls. The vase returned to its rightful place on the mantel, perfectly centered, as if it had never been moved. Slowly, the house began to feel like what it once was, mine. But Friday brought the storm. When I pulled up to the house after work, I saw them, Dad, Linda, and Sophie, all standing in the driveway. Their suitcases were still in the trunk of the rental car. Dad looked nervous, avoiding eye contact with me. Linda's face was flushed with rage, and Sophie stood a little off to the side, her expression a sour mix of embarrassment and irritation. Linda started yelling the moment I stepped out of the car. "How dare you change the locks on our house?" she screamed, stomping after me as I walked toward the door. "This is illegal. This is breaking and entering. We'll call the police." I ignored her tirade and calmly approached the door, sliding the key into the lock. Linda followed me, her words growing more frantic. "How dare you lock us out of our own house? We'll take you to court. We'll get a lawyer," she shouted, her voice shrill, until I finally turned to face her. Something inside me clicked. My posture straightened, and my voice was firm and steady. "No, Linda. This isn't your house. It never was. This house belongs to me." She froze, her face a mask of stunned disbelief. "My mother bought this house long before she even met Dad," I continued. "She left it to me in her will. The only reason you've been living here is because I allowed it. Temporarily." Linda laughed, but it was unsteady, almost hysterical. She turned to Dad, as though searching for support. "Tell her she's lying," she demanded. "Tell her this is our house." But Dad just stood there, shoulders slumped, avoiding her gaze. "She's telling the truth," he mumbled at last. "This house has always been hers." Linda's face changed instantly. The rage gave way to something else, calculation. Suddenly, she began laughing, her tone softening, almost mocking. "Oh, Meryl, sweetheart," she said with a fake smile. "You didn't think I was serious, did you? Come on, you know how it is. Vacation, sunshine, tropical cocktails." It all went in my head. "Stop," I cut her off sharply, but she pressed on. "We're family, remember? All those wonderful times, the book club, the dinners, the holidays. We can get back to that, darling." She stepped toward me, arms outstretched as if she were about to hug me. Dad suddenly stepped forward, his face twisted with emotion, his voice shaking. "Princess. I'm so sorry. I know I've done everything wrong, but I love you. You're my daughter. Please, let's work this out." I looked at him. I really looked at him. Here stood the man who left me when I was 9, who paid for my education but was otherwise absent from my life. The man who lied about my house, my inheritance, my mom's legacy. It made me wonder what had happened to the father I once knew. "You lied to your wife about who owns this house," I began, my words growing firmer with every passing second. "You stood by while she planned to throw me out of my mother's home. You didn't even try to defend me." Linda turned to me, her mask of friendliness slipping back into place. "Meryl, let's be reasonable," she said in a soft, coaxing voice, as though she were trying to placate a child. We can all live here together. We'll pay rent to make it fair. No, my voice rang out like a gunshot. Your things are in the garage. Take them and leave. Linda's mask cracked immediately. Her face contorted with fury. You ungrateful little, she began, her voice dripping with venom. After everything we've done for you, you're throwing your own family out on the street? I stared at her, feeling a strange calm settle over me. You just spent $10,000 on a luxury vacation you didn't tell me about. I'm sure you can afford an apartment. Meryl, please, Dad reached out to me again, but I stepped back. No, I interrupted. This isn't just a mistake. You lied for 4 years. You let Linda believe she owned my mother's house. You stood by as she tried to erase everything that reminded me of Mom. And when she was ready to throw me out, you said nothing. I was going to tell her the truth, he protested. I was just waiting for the right moment. After I was gone. After she'd completely taken over this house. I shook my head, unable to listen to another word. I'm done. Pack your things and leave. I turned and walked into the house, shutting the door behind me, ignoring Linda's shouting, which now sounded like distant noise. Through the window, I watched as they loaded boxes from the garage into their rental car. Linda was screaming so loudly that her face had turned red, while Sophie stood next to my dad, crying. Dad looked defeated, like a man finally confronted by the consequences of his actions. It took them 3 trips to load everything. When they were putting the last box into the car, Dad knocked on the door, but I didn't open it. They drove away as the sun was setting. The next day, Dad tried calling me again from a new number. Meryl, please, he began, his voice full of pleading. We can fix this. No, Dad, we can't, I replied calmly but firmly. Linda made it perfectly clear what you think of me, a freeloader, an obligation, a burden. Maybe those were her words, but your silence said far more. After that call, I stopped answering. That was 2 months ago. Now, I live in Mom's house. In my house. I've repainted the walls, planted new roses in the garden, and made it mine again. Everything they tried to erase, I've restored with love and care. The house feels like her again, her warmth, her presence. Sometimes, I think about them. I wonder where they are now, how they're doing. But those thoughts are fleeting. Most of the time, I think about Mom. About how she made sure I'd always have a place to come back to. Even when everything else was falling apart, she made sure I was taken care of. Dad still tries to call me sometimes, using different numbers, but I don't answer anymore. Some bridges are burned too thoroughly to ever rebuild. Funny enough, I'm happier now than I've been in years. My job is going well, I've made new friends, and for the first time since Mom passed, I feel at peace in this house. This house is mine now. Sometimes, healing means letting go of lies, letting go of people who don't value you, and letting go of the fantasy of a family that never truly existed.